A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a friend who's dear to me, and the subject of meeting up for a school reunion came up. Now, she was a little uncertain about the reunion because she mentioned that a few people, and one person in particular, was definitely not going to come, or at least he was going to come amid a lot of discomfort because he had explained that he had had very bad experiences in middle school, and some way, somehow, he hadn't completely resolved them, so that thinking about meeting up the people from middle school gave him, a level of unease or a level of discomfort that, made him reconsider actually coming to that meeting. Why am I talking about this? It seems almost like, yes, somebody doesn't want to go to a middle school reunion. So what? Now, it's very important for us as human beings to understand that the situations and the events that we go through have an effect on us in ways that we may not always recognize. I'm talking about this in relation to a topic that's important to me, which is trauma. Trauma happens in everyday life, and if it's not discharged properly, it morphs, it changes, and over time it starts to present itself in symptoms and ways that we don't even recognize and we feel like we can't deal with. I'm saying this because the difficulty that you're having with your neighbor, the challenges that you're having with your spouse, the roadblocks that you're seeing with your boss may all be as a result of unresolved trauma. Now, when trauma isn't resolved, guess what? It presents as hypervigilance. It presents as nightmares, difficulties in sleeping, depression, sometimes back pain. You may have persistent chronic pain that might be a result of unresolved trauma. Some of the time you find that it presents as detachment. A lot of the time, in fact, you find that it presents as detachment. And the most common is isolation. So we are quick to blame the person who likes to keep their space and who likes to not immediately connect with people, but we don't understand that might just be a trauma response, and that might be the way in which they protect themselves. So in trying to bring this to attention, what I intend to do long term is to get people to share stories about traumatic events that they may or may not have faced. Until then, I think that it's great to build a knowledge base and to build an understanding of what trauma actually is and the far-reaching effects that it can have on our lives, and also to understand the different ways in which it presents. How am I building this knowledge base? By spending time talking to not a colleague, a friend of mine who took out the time to explain the work that she does with trauma patients and some of the challenges she faces. Keep the questions coming, keep the comments coming. But above all of that, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Okay, so a good starting point, Dr. Shaima, would be for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, mainly working with adults. So I have specialized in working with that population, and due to my experience working in the public sector here in the UAE, I actually specialized in a few areas. Trauma is one of the significant areas that I worked with and trained in, and that was mainly with population, with women and children, families in general, but the LGBT community. Okay. I mean, when I worked in the UAE, there weren't many services or acceptance for such a community. Domestic violence, I mean, that's why I mentioned women and children. It's just because the families are exposed to that before. And this was even before the laws came out, because it was only recent that we have Wadima law, which protects children. Yeah. But I was working in the UAE before that law even came out, so we had to be creative in how to protect children and women, and with shelters that are anonymous or under protection. But thankfully, we do have the appropriate shelters under organizations and governmental organizations and police that do protect now. So we've come a long way.
That's impressive. That's impressive. Well done. So, trying to understand the work that you do, or some of the patients that you've worked with, how do you, or when do you classify an experience as being traumatic? Is there some sort of a checklist, or what do you look at?
Well, I'm a consultant using a specific type of therapy called EMDR, so eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Okay.
And the way that Dr. Francine Shapiro, who is the founder of this type of treatment, the way that she explains trauma or how she conceptualizes trauma using this type of treatment is a lot more loose compared to the traditional way or the DSM and how the DSM describes it. I mean, the DSM talks about exposure to life-threatening events or being in a life-threatening event, whereas with EMDR and the theories behind EMDR is that any distressing event could be considered a trauma because our brain structure actually changes when the information is experienced through our senses. The age that we experience these distressing events. So she talks about a big T and a small T. And the small T could be getting bullied at school or being humiliated. And the big T would be something major that, you know, to all of us would probably classify as PTSD, so rape or being at war. So it's any distressing event that threatens your well-being.
Right.
And and specifically well-being, because it's your, even the way that you conceptualize or receive information in the future is colored by your previous experiences.
So would you just say that is something that makes you uneasy, or the unease has to be at, you know, go beyond a certain level for you to say this is traumatic?
Well, let's say, just to make it even more biological, if you have a visceral bodily reaction to a specific event, consider it a trauma.
Okay.
So that's just clear enough, because it's that part of the brain, which is the emotional brain, where the brainstem, the amygdala, your danger zone, that detects danger. If that's activated, then it's a trauma. And that can be activated. Think of people who are embarrassed of public speaking. That part of the brain will be activated. But is it just because they're afraid of public speaking? No, it's related to something. It could be something about how they perceive themselves, which is an unrelated event to public speaking. It could be being humiliated. It could be believing that they're not good enough or they're not worthy. And that message must have come across in an incident. And
they carry that with them into everything else, including public speaking.
And it generalizes to that. So
But do you, with the patients you work with, do you think that do people tend to realize that an experience is traumatic while they are living it, or do they usually, you know, does it usually dawn on them once they sort of get out of it somehow? Usually, what do you see with people? Are they very aware of, you know, themselves, or what you've just told us, enough to know that when I'm going through this, it makes me feel this way, so this might be some form of trauma that I need to work to get out of? Or do they live it and then, you know, find out after?
No clear answer, just because, let's say, the new generation and TV and media has made this information very accessible. So some people could classify, whereas others that minimize, for example, being beaten as a child by their parents. They go like, well, what's the big deal? That's not traumatic. And that's not, it's culturally appropriate. Like, even if it's culturally appropriate, it's still traumatic. So it depends how people perceive what trauma is. Awareness is a big part of therapy, as you know. So people, and when I do get a client that comes in that in the beginning completely minimizes everything, then it's like, oh, okay, we've got a lot of work to do. And to prepare for the worst. Because the lack of an awareness or the ignorance has actually allowed this client to survive. So when you start opening their eyes, what's going to happen then? the roller coaster of emotions and the depression and the horrifying nature of, oh my God, this actually happened to me. That realization could throw a person into a downward spiral before they come back up.
Indeed.
So this is where, I guess, things like that, I don't even know, it's not, you'd have to figure out your clinical intuition just to see what the client is prepared for, what they want out of therapy, and if it's even suitable for them at the time.
Right.
This is where you would use your judgment and see if a client, if you feel like, no, I think with this client we need to work superficially because this is just too much for them to handle. And a lot of clients are not ready.
I've never thought about it that way. That's good insight.
Because it takes time. It takes time. You could put down like a whole treatment for eating disorders, for example. But if a client comes in and they're like, I'm not going to fill out these monitoring sheets. I'm just not going to.
Yeah.
You have to be creative in, okay, so all of this stuff is a little bit too much for you right now because they don't want to see it. You figure, you work with where, you have to work where they're at.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Wow. Okay. That's a lot of insight. Like I said, I had never thought about it before. It almost feels like when someone comes to you for therapy, you just go in and then you try to help them get better the traditional way or the...
But it's different for every single client. And the more that you work in this field, the more humbling.
You realize that.
The more humbling it is. I can teach them a set of skills, I can guide them, but the healing is done by them.
Of course.
When they're ready.
Yeah.
Because you know what? I've inherited clients from other psychologists, and they've done a lot of good work with other people, but then when they come to me, it's not that they couldn't break through, they weren't ready. So by the time they get to me, they're like, okay, so, and then we get deeper, and I consult with previous psychologists, and they're like, and I had to ask them if they'd worked on that, and they hadn't. But it's where the client is at, and what they needed to work on at the time. So this is why, you try to manualize psychotherapy, but it's a relational. It's the relationship, and that's so significant and so healing, while respecting the client's boundaries and understanding that it's a work in progress, and it always will be a work in progress. We in general as people are a work in progress, and therapy is just a part of that.
Now there's an interesting part. I know we mentioned this briefly, something that you anyway, I'll talk about it. This is the concept of the Stockholm Syndrome. How does this usually play out, in abusive relationships?
So identifying with the perpetrator?
Exactly. How does it usually
I wouldn't say that victims identify with the perpetrator, but I would say that victims or people underestimate how hard it is to leave the cycle of abuse.
Right.
When either women or men get into relationships or get into situations that are filled with domestic violence, it's like your makeup, your psychological makeup has been broken down. You end up being isolated, riddled with self-doubt, and who knows what type of controls are placed on you, whether it's financial or physical. If you've been manipulated into thinking that the people around you are out to get you, and your partner is your savior, then who do you have left in the world? So no matter what happens with your partner, you end up going back.
Exactly.
So it's out of necessity sometimes as well. And if there's financial
dependency,
some people, there are some clients that are not ready to give that up, and that shouldn't be taken lightly. It's not easy.
Exactly.
It's not. We don't live in the easiest world where a person who is also I mean, perpetrators tend to choose people who are not completely independent. Or even if they were independent, they try to do things to create dependency.
Yes.
So that there is more control.
Of course.
So that there's more control. So it's not as much as, it's not identifying, but the only thing that I would say is sometimes what happens is, especially when this happens in relationships early on, the victim ends up becoming a perpetrator.
Right.
Either within this cycle or in future cycles. Because they've learned that behavior.
Of course. So it's easy to play out that behavior even in a different situation. So also very much in line with the next question, do you think that some people are more prone to getting into or staying into abusive relationships? For example, is there a character trait that I thought it was important that the subject of perception was covered, in that one victim might find a situation traumatic while another won't, or a culture might classify an experience as traumatic while another just dismisses it. We've just started discussing how abuse in relationships and its residual trauma usually plays out. Join us in discovering how, as loved ones, we can support our friends and loved ones through traumatic experiences, and maybe even help them overcome. My name is Baba. If you haven't already, subscribe, rate, and like this podcast. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Hearts and Minds Aloud. Thank you for listening. Until next week.